Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In this episode, Jen and Jonathan are joined by Dennis Lindinger, one of our senior solution architects at Razorleaf, to unpack the topic of customization in the context of PLM systems. They explore the difference between configuration and customization, along with the benefits and challenges of customization, such as the importance of documentation when it comes to customizing software. Organizations need to take the time to understand a PLM system's full capabilities and identify the gap between what the business needs and what the software can do. Let's listen in with Dennis, Jonathan, and Jen.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. I am Jen Ferrillo, and I'm here with my colleague, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're tackling the topic of customization, talking about what it is, whether or not it's a good thing, a bad thing, what sorts of things do you need to consider when you're contemplating customization. We're talking today in the context of PLM, but it could be any system, could be ERP, MES, any business platform that you're using. Joining us today is our colleague and PLM industry veteran, Dennis Lindinger. Dennis, before we get started, can you give our listeners a bit of background on yourself and the work that you do here?
Absolutely. Good to see everybody. Thank you for having me on. As Jen said, my name is Dennis Lindinger, and I've been a Razorleaf employee since 2004, so my 20th year here.
Congratulations.
And, thank you very much. And my role currently is the Aris Innovator Solutions Manager. So all the products, all the sales that we do around Aris, when we go to implement, they all kind of come through me at one point or another. That could be doing development, it could be marshaling resources, it could be specifying the solution. But prior to doing Aris Innovator, my history was smart team implementations and some CAD administration. I started off in an engineering environment, doing CAD administration and some design work. So I've been in this game for, it's hard to believe, for almost 30 years or so. Thank you for having me on.
That's where the industry veteran comes in. And don't worry, you're among friends. So where we usually start, I think, is with definitions, right? We're talking about customization. Jonathan, I think you had some clear direction on what customization is versus configuration, where some of the lines are there.
Yeah, and I think I think the first place that we want to touch on is something that people talk about a lot on this topic, and when they say, "Oh, customization," the opposite is out of the box, or OOTB is what you see it written as a lot of times. If you've ever seen that acronym and you're like, "What in the world does that mean?" They're talking about the anti-customization, but I think we ought to dig into that one first, right? What is out of the box? What does that mean? It sounds like to me, it's, well, you take the software as it comes out of the box. Not that software comes in a box anymore, but that's another
misnomer.
a couple of industry veterans talking about when software used to be in boxes. But anyway, the idea that you take it just as it comes and don't do anything to it, I think that's the misnomer, right? So to your point, Jen, we're really talking about taking a system like this, a business system, and either configuring it, using what the software vendor gave you as the capabilities for how to tweak it and mold it into what you do, or going the customization route, which is more involved, right? And I think we should dig into that definition, as we go. Like, what is customization? Are there kinds of customization, that kind of thing? But I think that's to level set. The distinction is not really out of the box in customization. It's configuration and customization. I don't know, is that fair, Dennis, from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I've ever done an implementation where I just did next.
Right.
And managed CAD and PLM's functions.
I guess that's true. I mean, even the software on your phone, right? You don't just do next. Those are, you change your settings, you change your parameters, et cetera. So,
right. I want notifications. I don't, that kind of thing. Yep.
Right. So then if it's not out of the box versus customization, it's configuration versus customization. Let's start there then. What kind of things would fall under configuration?
Yeah. So I think what comes to mind for me is, I need to add a new property. I need to track some new piece of metadata about a part or a document or a CAD model. And I use the administrative tools to go into the system and add a property and show it on a form, and maybe even mark it as required. So the user has to fill it out. Those are all typical things that we'll do through configuration. Another good example is a workflow map. So, all of these tools come with an out-of-the-box solution for a change process. But inevitably, every customer wants some additional review step or some additional configuration that who the activity is going to go to. That's all managed and done through configuration. I wouldn't call that customization. That's all configuration, at least in the majority of the systems that we're dealing with.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Dennis. And it can get more involved in that too, right? When you talk about things that you can configure, I mean, some of these systems, it's maybe not just a property, it's a whole data type, right? Like, well, the system doesn't natively manage lab tests. Oh, but I want a record for that, and I want it to go through a certain process and steps. Now I'm purposely giving kind of an example of, out there configuration, right? That's serious configuration that maybe not all systems handle. I mean, is that a topic that starts to take us into other pieces of our conversation today? Not all systems allow the same kind of configuration. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's been plenty of systems where I've worked in where you want to manage something that the system doesn't natively manage, some new business object. It's very, very difficult to do that, and that's where we start talking about customization. If it was right for that customer to do that, that's the kind of things that we would talk about customization for.
So that's an important point, right? That the boundary between configuration and customization is really different for every system. And it very much depends on what did the software OEM bake in terms of administrative tools. What did they think people could change? They wanted to allow them to change, that kind of thing. That's a part of what we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So another way that I'll distinguish customization from configuration is really what the administrative tools allow me to do. What is the vendor opened up? What tools have they given me? Have they given me a configuration mechanism to configure an integration? Or have they given me the tools to add a new business object? And usually if those tools are there, that's considered configuration.
Right. Your workflow example is a great one, right? I mean, I've seen some in the PLM space, some vendors' workflow is very simple. It's a series of steps. And sometimes you can't even control the number of steps, but that's what you get. And you can put people on the steps, and you can put tasks on the steps. There's things you can do. But then there's other vendors who say, "Oh yeah, draw me a picture, right? draw me a map, and then you can define whatever you want on that map." And it's like, wow, all right, that's really flexible. So yeah, configuration can be a lot of things, but you put a good definition on it. Hey, if they gave me a tool for how to control it and define it, well, that's configuring because it's within the bounds of what they had in mind. That makes sense.
Well, then if those things fall under the definition of configuration, then what would be something more? What would be customization? Just anything that you don't have the tools for? Are there any customizations that you do have tools for, like things along the lines of automation?
Yeah, in the world that I've been living in for the last 15 years or so, in the ARIS world, that you can write a method using the administrative tools. I would call that customization, but it's not customization. So we kind of jumped over the topic of, hey, why is customization considered bad? A lot of times we'll do customization. Let me rewind that. So if we go talk to a prospect, and we start talking about customization, and a lot of times they'll throw up their hands of, hey, we've been down that road. We've customized the heck out of SAP, and it becomes a dirty word. But some of these tools, ARIS and OVIA, they give you the ability to write some customizations inside the tool. They kind of expect some of those methods to be written. So the line is very fuzzy. when the vendor gives you a tool to write customizations. Like, where is that configuration or is it customization?
But it sounds like implicit in that, Dennis, your definition is if you're writing code. Is that fair? Like that means customization.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Okay,
that makes
so
sense.
and it's a little clearer too, because you're right. I mean, if they're giving you tools to do customization, then it couldn't be considered configuration.
Yeah. And I think you touched on an important point, the elephant in the room, right, Dennis, which is one of the reasons we're talking about this is a lot of people have the perception that customization is bad. And I think one of the things that we should talk about today is, well, is it all bad? Is it bad sometimes? Is there a bad way to do it? Or is it, no, it's just got a bad name. It's really not bad. So I'm looking forward to kind of digging into some of the why there and what's, the pros and cons. Maybe let's come back to configuration. What's so good about configuration? Like, why do people like that?
So a lot of value from the configuration. So I think businesses can get a lot of value from just doing some basic configuration. They can, every business has the need to track their own custom properties or their own business objects. And if the tool gives you the ability to create those, then by all means, take advantage of those, tailor that system so that it runs the way that you organize your business.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's why I think at the beginning I was saying, well, it's not really out of the box that we're comparing to customization, because most people see the logic of what you just said, Dennis, and they say, well, I'm going to configure it. Of course, I want to track the things I can track. And if I can do that in a way that as I upgrade the system in the future, that it's just going to be handled. And that's the implicit assumption, right? Is if you do something to the system using the administrative tools that the vendor provided, then you expect that's going to carry forward every time I upgrade or apply a service pack or whatever. You're not worried about like, oh, well, what if I do this to the system and then that means I can't upgrade or it's going to lose my data or whatever. I mean, that's kind of the part of configuration that we all assume, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is the assumption. So if I can add a property, the vendor gives me a tool to add a property, then I'm assuming the vendor will make that property available to me when I go to my new versions. Absolutely.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, well, and if the vendor is giving you the tools to do the configuration, one would assume that's going to be quicker and easier to implement, not just maintain and upgrade, but easier for the first time implementation, right? That this is how you do it. Okay. You don't have to dig in and be like, well, how am I going to figure this out on my own? There's instructions, you just follow them. Probably a lot easier to get those skills in-house as well.
Yeah,
following directions is a lot easier.
That's right.
Yeah, that's true. Training classes. So then what's the downside? I think, Jonathan, you kind of mentioned the downside of configuration is that basically the software has to match your process then, right?
I think that's an interesting point, Jen, right? It is, what are the limitations of configuration? Where is it not taking you that you might need to go? And why would you need to go somewhere else? Why are we even talking about another option beyond tailoring the system to what you need?
I think to do that, we need to get into customization then.
Yeah.
I mean, the bullet point on the industry best practices would basically, these are things that the vendor has put in. So I'm assuming they're pulling those from all of their different customers, and these are the things that they're doing that they traditionally need to configure. So this is, gives you some guidance in the direction that you're going with your software and with your processes.
Yeah, these are the typical properties that we have. This is the typical workflow process that we see customers using to release something. And then, that's a good starting point. That becomes a good starting point for an implementation. And if they give you the tools to modify those things, then that's great configuration that you could take advantage of to make it your own, make it your business's own.
Right. Particularly,
go ahead.
I was going to say, particularly if you're not, it's not a process that you've defined yet. You can just easily follow what the vendor themselves have recommended.
Yeah. If you're a first time, you don't have a PLM system, but maybe you have a paper process for releasing drawings and engineering content. You see what the vendor has provided for their out-of-the-box solution for that workflow process. That's a great place to start. If you don't have a process or electronic process, start with an industry known. Usually these solutions that the vendors provide are based on industry best practices like CM2 or whatever other processes we're talking about. There's usually some kind of standard behind it. So why not start with it?
I mean, the benefit there is you're quick out of the gate, right? I mean, somebody else is telling you, here's the software setup to support something and probably even providing some training on it. Here are the steps of what you would do and who would do it and that sort of thing. That's much faster than saying, let me either invent my own process or document my own process and then create software, in the tool to support that. It's much faster. Just take it, right? If it fits. There's where the challenge is, if it fits.
If it fits or if you're flexible enough.
Right.
If you're like, we've done it this way, but there's either the reason that we started doing it this way doesn't exist anymore, or there wasn't really, the guy that left or the guy that created the process is left and nobody else cares. We'll do it this way.
Or it fits, but you want to make a few tweaks to it. Again, that's where we get back to configuration. Start with that out-of-the-box model of that process, and add additional review steps, put the right people on those steps, and just use the configuration tools. But it becomes your starting point. Another thing that is really important, maybe a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but those tools that they give you, you're not limited to just using them on your initial implementation. Like, your processes change over time. Like, these tools are intended for you to add activities, add additional properties, do whatever you need to do later on, configure later on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dennis, right? That sometimes when you're implementing, you don't have to do everything up front. You can do what makes sense initially, however much sort of change you can handle, and then evolve it over time. And these tools can help you do that.
Absolutely.
That topic, though, of trying to find the process that fits and make the tool fit your process, that's sort of gets us logically into customization of, okay, so what happens when it doesn't, right? When what they provide you doesn't, when the tools that they provide you to change it, to try and tailor it, still don't get you there. That's often when we get into customization, right? Because the idea is, well, now I can do almost anything. I can write code to do just about anything. But is that it? I mean, I feel like customization there's some categories to it, right? I mean, I'll throw mine out there and you tell me what you think. I think when you're customizing, it could be, sure, I need to do anything. I need to make a purple spotted cow as part of my process. So I do that and I wrote software to do it. But there's also, I just need to do this thing that's outside of the process. I need to get a part number, and the system doesn't have a facility for making part numbers, so I need to go make a part number and then come back. Or there's other kinds of customizations that are simply, I just want to automate that step in the process. I want to follow what the vendor gave me exactly, but at step 3, if value X is this, then move on to step 4. If value X is this other thing, then move on to step 7. Just an automation, right? So I think there's all kinds of customizations. Is that what you see, that there's sort of different categories there?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of these systems that we're talking about all have some kind of event model, right? There's when some event happens, when the document is released or the workflow gets to an activity or the workflow is closed, hook that event to write a little bit of automation to go send an email or communicate with some other business system to send your bill of material over. That, is that customization? Yeah, the vendor's still giving me a tool to go manage those things, but I still consider it customization.
Right. You had to write some code.
I had to write some code, right?
Right. But at that level, that sort of, I'm just automating something that happens or kind of can happen naturally. That's pretty straightforward. That's pretty simple. And to your point earlier, sometimes the vendor expects you're going to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And then sometimes you, there are different levels of that, right? So I'll give you for instance, in the ARIS world, the event model that I spoke about, that thing is really easy to customize, and the vendor really expects you to do that, to hook these events and write some business logic. Sometimes we we have to do something in the code tree. Like we have to kind of change the underlying files. And the vendor will look, it's open for you to do, but it is we think about it differently. That's a last resort for us. We don't customize there unless we absolutely have to. We try to keep it in the data model. The vendor will still upgrade in our case, those code tree files, but in other cases, other vendors, when you stray from kind of what's in the system, like what's in the database, so to speak, like that's where it becomes difficult to upgrade those customers, and they feel locked in at times.
And this is where the customization gets a bad name, right? That's the kind you're talking about here, where you've said, look, I know the software vendor wrote the software to do these things, but I need them to be different. So I'm going to change what's under the hood. The vendor, if they looked at it, they'd say, well, that's not how my software behaves, right? Because you've changed it. And I think to your point, some vendors are fine with that. They encourage it. It's like, sure, do it. Great. It's within the bounds of what I meant. Other vendors are, yeah, if you have to. But boy, when you upgrade, you need to watch out for that. Right? But so there's a spectrum there. And to your point, that maybe is where, like you said earlier, some people are like, look, we just went through an SAP upgrade and our system was highly customized and it was really painful. It's probably due to that kind of thing where somebody had done deep surgery on the system, and there are a lot of gotchas there. We should come back to that, like what those pitfalls are. But that's what you're saying, right? So there's that category. There's the automations, kind of simple, make it happen, automate the steps. There's the deep surgery category. Are there more? Is there another thing you can do that's different?
I think you're probably dancing around the idea of integrations, maybe extending you need to do something outside the system, but maybe your system is the trigger. I can think of many cases where our middleware Clover will have some application-specific APIs. If the vendor changes those APIs, it's fine that the vendor upgrades the system and handles those all those internal customizations, but you still have another component. The business has another component to think about, whether it's Razorleaf's middleware or somebody else's middleware. If those things are relying on those APIs that the customer has, that the vendor has, then you have to take those into consideration when you're planning your upgrade. Do you have to do some redevelopment, or do you have to modify that code that's been deployed already?
Yeah. So I mean, you're touching on one of the key things about customizations, which is you have to pay attention anytime you change the underlying software, fix, pack, upgrade, new deployment, whatever it might be, to say, well, what changed? And there's the insides that could have changed, and you're touching on what about external interfaces? So maybe you had something happen outside of the system, and that code isn't impacted, but the way that they handed back and forth, or the data they shared with each other, whatever, those are things you have to pay attention to. So that last category you're talking about, where it's like customization, but it's outside of the system, you still have to be aware of it, but it's different than the deep surgery, and it's different than the automation. Yeah,
absolutely. And many times as the business, it's your responsibility. Your vendor does not care about your middleware and upgrading, make sure the DLLs that that middleware is using, or the calls that middleware is. The vendor doesn't care that thing works. So it's up to you to make sure that's in your test plan.
Right. It's not that they don't care; they just don't know.
Right? They're like, I can't care.
They care deeply.
I think it's important, though, that you differentiated those, Dennis. Right? That there are some different categories, and some of them have yielded the bad name, the bad reputation. And the reason for it, right, is it's caused people problems when they've upgraded. It's caused extra cost, extra headache, whatever.
So then why do it? Why not just follow the configurations? Why would you try to make it do something that it doesn't naturally do?
Well, sometimes it's your business's secret sauce. That is your advantage. You've got you got a product. You have many product lines in your business, and there's product owners throughout the business. If it in some systems, or in a paper-based system, somebody needs to know who all those people are that would be responsible for. And if that that's tribal knowledge. If you go, that person leaves the company, that's lost. If you could encode that, if you could say, hey, I can let you define a product line in the system, and I can let you define who the product manager is, and I can write some automation that says, okay, these are the products associated with this change process are these product owners, and get that thing routed over there. If I can get that change done quicker, and that's my secret sauce to getting to market faster, then that's a good reason. That may be a good reason to write some customization.
It's interesting. That was a great example, Dennis, because when I think about the things that hold people up and cause problems, right? It's that logic you just described that is your secret sauce that helps you get to market and win more. If it takes you too much effort to change it, when you add a new product line, when you change your reporting structure, like if it's a huge headache and it causes a big interruption in your business, well, then that advantage is a disadvantage. And this is where we have that yin and yang, right? Between, well, if my tool lets me customize easily, then maybe customization isn't so bad and it gives me my business advantage. If a tool is very hard to change and I have encoded a lot of things about my business and then it gets in my way, well, then maybe there's the bad reputation of customization. Is that, I catching on in terms of what you see, the challenges?
Absolutely. I think when an organization is considering customization, I think they need to consider some key things. What are your costs of development? What are your costs to not develop it? What are your costs for upgrades? I think you also need to rely on your vendor to make sure that you're make sure that you're making the right decisions. Are you taking this customization or this thing that you want to do? Are you taking it too far? Are you trying to do accounting in your PLM system? Like, you should have a vendor that is making sure, checking you, a vendor or a partner that is making sure that you're making good decisions. That those things, if you have a vendor that is just saying yes to everything that you want to do, that's not necessarily a good thing. Makes you feel good, right? Makes you think you're right all the time. But man, sometimes those situations can lead you down a pretty dark alley. That's
a great point that you're bringing up, Dennis, about are you doing the right thing in the right tool, right? What you mentioned about accounting and PLM, because it's easy. I think it can be easy to convince yourself, well, I got 70, 80% of the data here in PLM. Let me just do this thing like MES in the PLM.
Yeah.
Well, in some cases, if you just need to add 10% on and it's customization, maybe that does make sense. But in other cases where you're like, well, I really want to do this other thing, and this is just step 1 of 12 to get a full MES implemented, maybe it's time to take a step back and say, well, I need another system and integrate it rather than let me customize and extend this thing to do all these functions for me. Yeah. And it's a great consideration about what makes sense for me. Lots of things to consider there. What else do you think people should be thinking about?
Certainly, we've mentioned this a few times, but that idea of what the future upgrades of your product look like. Are you going to have to redevelop? Are you going to have do you have the source code to redevelop? In some cases, maybe that source code is in the system. Sometimes it's compiled in a DLL. And have you made arrangements with your partner to have that source code so that you're protected when you want to do an upgrade? And are they going to have you? Is there going to be a cost associated if they're going to do that upgrade process?
Yeah, we talked about what you're doing in the customization, but you're pointing out an important thing about how. How did you do the customization? Did somebody just hand you a result, or do you know how they got there? And who's going to own fixing it, updating it, changing it? Do you have to go back to them? Can you do it yourself? I've seen a couple of, I won't say horror stories, but unfortunate situations where customers didn't, in the process of doing the customization, they didn't document it or they didn't retain that documentation, so they're not clear why they did it or even exactly what they did. And so what you're left with is picking up, well, here's what it is. Now what do I do? Do I have to update it because they still have to have it? And so I got to fix anything that might be broken when I go to upgrade them? Or can I pare it back? There's a bunch they don't even use anymore, so let's pair, or we don't need it.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, many times I have have a recent example. A customer went from Oracle to SAP or vice versa. I can't remember. But they had a bunch of methods written, customizations written in the system. And, they've come to us after their implementation. So, they've kind of switched resellers or switched vendors. And we were solving some unrelated problem for them. And all of a sudden we start pointing out, hey, there's a bunch of calls here to Oracle and you're on SAP now. What is it? We don't know. Like,
right.
we don't remember what those are for. We don't know what they do. We don't have a relationship with the vendor who did it for us anymore. Like, holy cow, it can really be tough. So having a good set of documentation around your customizations and why they're there and what their purposes are, it can be very, very helpful in the long term.
And critical when you change people too, right? I've seen that plenty where it's like, oh yeah, while the implementer, like let's say the champion internal to the business is there, great, everything's fine, right? And it's like, it's almost this paradoxical problem of the stronger the personality there, right? The more that person sort of had everything in mind, had everything under control, maybe the less documentation there was, and the tougher it is when they leave and somebody else has to step in and say, well, now what? Right? I don't know. They're not here. I can't ask them. They didn't leave me a trail of breadcrumbs. Gets off the topic, but I think that's one of the challenges of customization, right?
Well, but I don't think it is necessarily off the topic because right now, I mean, up until this point, we've all been talking about within the context of a single business. How many businesses these days get acquired or merge or and they're using different systems or different versions, and the more customization there. And the less people then as you're merging together or as you're trying to coordinate those systems, that's got to make everything even more challenging. I think that's another time when people go back and look at their customizations like, do we actually need these? Can we change this? Can we change our processes?
That's a great one to point out too, Jen, is so you change your process or you need to, or maybe you should, right? Do people look at that often enough about customizations and say, well, we customized this. We're going to have to upgrade in a year or two or upgrade in 6 months, and we haven't looked at it in a while. Is the smart thing to do to look at, well, why did we customize in the first place? Go back to that documentation that hopefully you have and evaluate that even before you do the upgrade. Because maybe in the upgrade, you could get rid of the customization.
Yeah, there's been many cases where we will, a customer who's been on a platform for a very long time, we may have done some customizations for them that were critical, and they solved a need, and then all of a sudden the vendor realizes, hey, that was a hole in the product, and let's release a product that does that. So now the customer's got to decide, like, does it make sense for me to? It's not what the vendor releases is not exactly what I need, but can I make the shift? Can I migrate data? Can I tailor that thing so I don't have this full customized solution that I got to maintain?
It points to, Dennis, the fact that a lot of this should be a business calculation, right? It's not that customization or configuration or any of that is good or bad. None of it's in a vacuum. It's, well, what does it cost to do it? Because your point, that scenario you just gave, maybe it makes sense to change to what the vendor did. Maybe it throws away your secret sauce. So maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's like, well, I should get there, but over time. It's too expensive today, but maybe it makes sense later.
Another variable in that calculation is the business's appetite. Like, there are some businesses that are all about, making this tool specific to how they want to run their business, customizing and there are other businesses, other organizations that, hey, I just want to go next, and add some properties. Like, if your organization has a staff that is, in a personality, the business has a personality to do these kinds of customizations, and you're willing to take on the task of maintaining them, it can really be powerful for an organization. But that's not every organization, and that plays into the tool that you select as well. And some of the tools are very, very great, very, very good about allowing you to customize and configure, and other tools are not. So, you need to know how your business thinks about it. You need to know how your tool or your vendor thinks about it. You need to understand how your partner thinks about it. They all kind of play together in the calculation whether you should customize something or not.
That's a great term you use, Dennis, the personality, right? Personality of a business. How do you look at things? Because certainly we've had customers who they have maybe they have IT staff, or maybe it's just they use partners, but they want the tool to match exactly what they do or how they want it to work. And they're all about, efficiency or those kinds of things. And then we've had other customers who say, look, it's just a tool, right? I can get my job done with a hammer or whatever, but, give me a tool close enough and I'll keep moving because that's not my focus. But they're very different personalities, and they would look at these topics we're talking about in very different ways.
Absolutely. And we have some that are both of those things. They want to tailor this thing or make it very specific to their business. They're not interested in having a staff to do it. They're not interested in, they just want it done, and they're happy to work with their partner to continue maintaining it over time. But I think all three of those things, your business's personality, the personality of your software, and the personality of your vendor, all kind of need to play together, and you need to find a happy mix that gives you the solution that you need.
It's funny. It reminds me of another episode we were working on recently, talking about infrastructure, and I think the same theme came up, right, yeah. Jen? It was, right. Well, what's right for you? What's the right fit for a given organization and that organization's personality? How much do you want to do in-house? How much do you want to do out-of-house? What do you need? How fast do you need it? All those kinds of things. So it is important to find the right fit.
So it seemed like when we're talking about as far as whether or not to customize, use out of the box, or configure rather than customize, from what I'm hearing is don't customize what you don't need to. So, or another way of putting that would be, do you need to customize this? Is this something that is critical to your business, or is this something that, based on the tools available, that you can simply configure? You can change your process a little bit, because customization does take longer and it does have a higher total cost. That's another thing to consider. You had to consider the total cost, not just of the implementation or the customization originally, but the cost of upgrading and maintaining that.
One of the things I want to add to it, though, is when you said decision, it was an important point, right? And it's a business decision, or should be, not a personal decision. Because I think I've seen that. Dennis, maybe you've seen it too. It's the person sort of leading the implementation, or a technical team might answer the question you just brought up, right? But they answer it from their perspective, maybe not the whole business's perspective.
Without a doubt. Yeah. You should definitely be including the entire business in that. And that kind of my final point was going to be that you need to, and this was what Dennis was saying as far as that coming together, you need to know your tool and what it can do, and you need to know your business and its appetite for customization. Just not just initially, but maintaining that moving forward. So, is there anything else that I missed?
I think you covered them.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jen.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Dennis, for joining us today. It was good to have you on.
Again, thank you for having me. It was a great experience.
Well, it was a fun topic, Dennis.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Maybe we'll have you back. I wanted to remind our listeners to, if there's any questions that you had on this topic, or is there anything that you felt that we missed, or just another topic you'd like to hear us discuss and dig into, let us know. Reach out to us on social media. Remember to subscribe on your particular platform to the podcast. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions for our podcast team, or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover this year, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Also, leave a comment on our post, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.